You're watching NBC10's Race in Philly.
Stopping Asian hate. Crimes targeting Asian Americans have risen dramatically since the start of the coronavirus pandemic.
Families have had rocks thrown at them. Nurses have been spit on.
Race in Philly explores the growing crisis, the calls for peace, and what community leaders are doing to try to bridge the divide.
And spreading a message of hope through virtual learning. The Philadelphia teacher inspiring Asian students to push through some tough circumstances.
We need to stay positive. We'll get back together soon.
You're watching Race in Philly. I'm Jim Rosenfield.
I'm Jacqueline London. We begin with the calls to stop hateful acts against people of Asian descent. Incidents involving hate crimes and bias are on the rise since the start of the pandemic.
NBC10's Claudia Vargas took a look at the problem here in Philadelphia.
A doctor and med school professor during the pandemic, Dr. Austin Chang is seen as a hero to many.
Health professionals were getting a lot of recognition for what we were doing.
That is, until he walked out of the hospital doors one day last year.
Someone shouted a racial slur at me, and this was kind of a really jarring situation for me.
Since the start of the pandemic, Asian Americans say they have experienced some harassment, bias, and even assaults simply for being of Asian descent.
And I sat down next to someone on the train, a woman, and she looked over, saw that I was Asian American, and immediately started yelling at me, screaming profanity at me, telling me to move away from her because she thought she was going to get the coronavirus.
On March 16th, a gunman killed 6 Asian Americans at spas in the Atlanta area. Even before then, the Asian community was already on edge.
They don't want to go out in public. They don't want to take public transportation, even though they have to go get groceries.
As executive director of the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, John Chin says he has heard many of these stories. He shared some of those during a recent No Hate virtual town hall event.
It was very upsetting and angering to me that some of my fellow Asian Americans don't feel safe enough to go out and just live life normally.
Philly saw an uptick in reported incidents of hate crimes and bias against Asian Americans in 2020. That's according to stats collected by the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations. In 2019, the commission received 8 reports of hate crimes against members of the Asian community. In 2020, the number of calls jumped to 28. 19 of those were reports of racial bias. 9 were hate crime incidents, 6 of which were reported to police, and 3 were reported directly to the commission.
You can't compel a person to report to the police if they want to.
It's unclear how many of those 2020 hate crimes resulted in arrest. The district attorney's office didn't prosecute any of the 2020 incidents against Asian Americans for ethnic intimidation, the official hate crime charge in Pennsylvania. The DA's office responds by saying, in part, "We apply the law based on facts and evidence in all cases." The office used the ethnic intimidation charge in 1 case so far this year. Sometimes people of Asian descent don't report hate crimes or incidents of bias and discrimination.
The language barriers and the lack of the familiarity with the procedures and access, and also the fear of retaliation.
Stephanie Sun, executive director of Governor Wolf's Asian American Affairs Commission, says another reason for underreporting is fear of deportation.
They may not want to expose themselves to government and law enforcement.
And for non-criminal incidents, victims may simply not know there's a way to take action. That was the case for Dr. Chang.
I wasn't aware of, what the appropriate reporting mechanism was.
Not to mention, he says, he was a little busy at the time.
At the time, I was just so consumed by everything else that was happening with the pandemic that didn't even think to do that.
But he believes that if that would have happened today, he may have treated it differently.
Given the more recent events, it makes me think twice.
Claudia Vargas, NBC10 News.
Philadelphians can report non-emergency hate and bias incidents to the Commission on Human Relations. The agency's number is 215-686-4670. The commission also has an anonymous hotline. That number is 215-686-2856.
The suspected gunman in the Atlanta spa shootings blamed a sex addiction, not hate. But Asian activists say the fact that most of the victims were Asian women was not a coincidence. The attack, they say, is the result of historic stereotypes against Asian women, leaving them objectified and hypersexualized, feeling invisible or silenced. As NBC10's Danny Freeman tells us, there is hope this tragedy will be a catalyst for change.
To be honest, I felt very numb.
When Philadelphia's Sarah Young heard of the horrific mass shooting in Atlanta, which killed 6 Asian American women, she couldn't even bring herself to read the news.
I think at the bottom of it, I felt like despair.
But when she heard police describe the suspect's motive,
he apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction.
The pain became personal.
I mean, it's disgusting. It connects me back to all of the ways that my body has been looked at.
For Asian and Asian American women, racist hypersexualization is real.
This idea that we're, submissive, that we're like exotic and mysterious.
And it's been real for a long time.
This wasn't Asian Americans who happened to be women that were murdered. They were murdered specifically because they were Asian American women.
University of Pennsylvania's senior lecturer Rupa Pillai explained racist sexualization dates back as far as 1875 with the legislation known as the Page Act,
which explicitly barred the immigration of Asian women who were assumed to be sex workers and were assumed to be an immoral threat to the American nation.
Adding, the problem continued with American military involvement in Asian countries.
All of those Vietnam War films further exacerbated this perception of Asian women being hypersexualized.
That's continuing to be perpetuated as Asian American women are bodies that we can have.
Sung Young Chai Morrow, executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, explained these views continue today.
We are completely invisible as human beings, but so hyper visible as sexual objects, and we need to change that era culture.
So how can we combat something systemic?
The first step is learning our history, period.
Learning the history, understanding the pain, speaking up when something's wrong, while acknowledging for this community, race and fetishization are inseparable.
The bulk of my harassment that I experience out there is really because I'm a woman and I'm Asian American. And so it's not possible to separate the two.
For Sarah, forward means her infant son growing up with a different perspective.
I want him to actively look out for the women in his life and to know and understand and remember the challenges they face.
A hope that awareness can come from tragedy. Danny Freeman, NBC10 News.
It's called the model minority myth. It's the stereotype that Asian Americans are all well-educated and wealthy, a stereotype often used to sow racial division. But the myth conceals the reality that many Asian American communities face generational poverty, issues with mental health, and access to health care. NBC10's Randy Gyllenhaal explains.
In this diverse pocket of South Philadelphia, families have already overcome a lot.
My parents were refugees with 3 little children.
After the Vietnam War, these blocks along South 7th Street became a new home.
In this neighborhood, we have a lot of Burma, Asian, Cambodia, Vietnamese.
For Southeast Asians fleeing war and violence, 1.1 million resettled across the U.S., but often they were sent to poor neighborhoods, navigating poverty and hostility.
When it comes to refugees, we hold a lot of trauma, a lot of PTSD, a lot of mental illness from the war and the genocide. Gives a space for...
Sarun Chan runs the Cambodian Association of Philadelphia, helping families with schoolwork and English, but also health care and social services. Many Asian American families face both generational poverty and a harmful myth that contends they got it easy.
That we don't create waves, we're all going to Ivy League colleges, we're all making high income.
It's called the model minority myth, a stereotype that casts every Asian as smart, a math whiz, maybe a doctor or engineer who's quiet and rarely complains. But it's a lie that can create unrealistic expectations and it can breed resentment.
The model minority myth, if you boil it down, was a way to put other minority groups against each other.
Data shows Asian Americans are just as likely to work in low-wage industries like beauty salons and factory work. In Philadelphia, 1 in 4 AAPI families live in poverty, much of it in South Philly, where 65% of Cambodian Americans are considered low income. That's the highest rate of any group in the city.
So there's a lot of needs and concerns that we face that aren't necessarily being heard.
And amid the backdrop of violence against Asian Americans, a new hope that this myth gets busted.
We're always open to inviting other cultures to learn more about us and our needs. And that's the best part about becoming part of this community. The food, the flavors, the art, the culture, and learning about the issues.
Randy Gyllenhaal, NBC10 News.
Taking a stand against racism by having open, honest, even uncomfortable conversations. Next, a look at the social media movement led by Asian and Black doctors.
You're watching NBC10's Race in Philly.
Over the past year, Asian and Black doctors were not only on the front lines fighting the coronavirus, they were also on the front lines taking a stand against racism.
They're using Instagram to host conversations about the racial divide. The talks have featured doctors, a congresswoman, and a Hollywood actress. NBC10's Brandon Hudson spoke with 2 of the doctors about their social media movement.
In a social media post which catches the ear, then educates, Dr. Gerald Unoaha took a stand against anti-Asian hate.
One of the reasons why I made the video that I made was because there were a lot of talk about whether or not Asian Americans were the cause of the coronavirus in America, which is untrue.
Where should we start this conversation?
The post sparked discussions about race relations between blacks and Asians, which have had a fractured history for decades.
I get it all the time.
One Instagram Live post featured Hollywood actress Olivia Munn, whose mother is of Chinese descent. Are we ready?
Yep. Yeah.
All right, cool. Recently, Dr. Unoaha and Philadelphia native Dr. Jennifer Chung took time out of their busy schedule saving lives to talk about their other passion, fighting discrimination with the platform Everybody versus Racism. An initiative born during 2020's racial reckoning, now focusing on unity between Asian and African Americans.
If people were to get together and have conversations about, where they're from, their culture, their race, then we would see that we have more things in common.
With the recent uptick in the hate crimes against the Asian community, what I started seeing was a widening divide between our communities.
What stereotypes exist in the Black community about Asians, and then the opposite.
In March, Everybody versus Racism held a series of Instagram Live chats with other doctors of color about race and implicit biases. A chance for open, honest, and at times uncomfortable discussion. Jennifer, how did that breakthrough feel?
I was very emotional because, you can see their wounds almost slowly healing by, just the honest conversations and understanding the other side.
Last year, Dr. Chung teamed up with other Asian doctors in a video calling out discrimination in COVID-19. Philly-based gynecologist Dr. Karen Tang was in the clip too. She also participated in one of the Everybody versus Racism talks.
Ending Asian hate, ending Black hate, and how we can kind of take practical steps.
Conversation and breakthrough was the first step. Next is turn talk into action.
A lot of us have been trying to kind of pivot the conversation towards practical ways to support the Black community, support the Asian community, to help address issues of these kind of anti-Asian attacks.
It's been an experience that has really just filled me with hope that we are able to move forward.
A group of doctors battling 2 pandemics, threatening to tear apart the fabric of their communities. Brandon Hudson, NBC10 News.
It's enough of a struggle to stay in business during the pandemic, but for some Asian American communities in Philly, the language barrier is hurting efforts to get much needed assistance. We take a closer look at that issue next.
You're watching NBC10's Race in Philly.
Businesses in Philadelphia's Chinatown neighborhood have struggled during this pandemic.
Business owners looking for help also face another obstacle, understanding the options available to them because some speak limited English. NBC10's Randy Gyllenhaal has more on this barrier for businesses.
With light beyond the pandemic, small businesses in Chinatown hope you'll come back to visit, but it's been a tough year. Revenue down 40%.
A lot of immigrants that don't speak English as a first language really rely on these jobs.
John Chin runs Chinatown's Development Corporation, and as we walk up 10th Street, he points to restaurants that have struggled, a Chinese clothing store whose owner was barely above water.
This is her life and her passion. She didn't want to give it up. And because she doesn't speak English as a first language, we actually sat her down and helped her to apply for multiple benefits.
Groups like this spent the last year translating all of those government news conferences, countless COVID health documents. In Philadelphia, nearly half of Asian Americans speak limited English, and during a pandemic, that information can be life-saving.
COVID really has sort of ripped the Band-Aid off of the underlying inequities.
LaSalle's director of public health programs says this led to people missing out on things like health care and accessing crucial PPP loans.
And just not having a lot of that information, really served as barriers to lots of communities.
And on top of it all, many Asian Americans also faced a year of COVID harassment, racist taunts, even affecting Congressman Andy Kim's family.
My mom's experienced this at the grocery store. People yelling at her, yelling at obscenities at her, and it's made her very fearful to be able to go outside.
We need to bring people from diverse backgrounds together and become united and stand against hate against all populations.
In Philadelphia's reopened Chinatown, Randy Gyllenhaal, NBC10 News.
Learning lessons that will go beyond the virtual classroom. Up next, how a Philadelphia teacher is going above and beyond to help Asian students during this pandemic.
You're watching NBC10's Race in Philly.
Virtual learning is really challenging for so many families, especially students whose parents don't speak English well enough to help with homework.
And that's where one Chinese-American teacher stepped in to help. As NBC10's Lucy Bustamante tells us, she's helping kids overcome language barriers and hate crimes against the Asian community.
Ready? Open your mouth.
Mabel Tsai is that teacher who the third graders love. They see her as fun and caring with the strict side.
I research them every day to see if I can find something fun to do.
Last Halloween, she took her third grade class at McCall Elementary in Society Hill to do a science experiment in the park in person. Even got them homemade goodie bags with her own two daughters in tow.
I basically met two groups of students that day. It was really nice.
And while all the kids love her, it's what she's done for the Asian population at McCall that has really put her on the principal's radar.
We have about 50% Asian population, mostly Chinese.
It's almost like they're carrying the weight of the world.
As if it's not hard enough trying to succeed in virtual learning with parents who don't speak English well enough to help you with homework. Add to that, dealing with real-life hate crimes against your family due to COVID.
They would only go check their mailbox at 1 o'clock in the morning because, people were calling them names. Some had said that individuals were spitting on them. So I think, in all honesty, I think a lot of our families have not left their homes much in the past year.
Principal Stephanie McKenna leans on Mrs. Tsai for help.
It's very close to Mabel, the work.
Can I tell you something, Lucy? This is why I'm at McCall. I know because I was born here, but an immigrant child as well. Even though they want their child to do well in school, they have no idea on how to help them.
So Ms. Tsai started to tutor one-on-one in Cantonese and in English, and finding other tutors to help. She uses tough talk to help them refocus on what they can control.
I feel like I'm a role model, and I tell these kids, look, listen to me. I was in your position, and I want a better life. And how do we do that? We get a good education and work hard. Keep working hard, okay?
And she reminds the kids that this too will pass, and it will only get better.
We need to stay positive. We'll get back together soon. Make the same size.
In Society Hill, Lucy Bustamante, NBC10 News.
Expanding your education on race is one of the key tools to fight systemic racism.
You can find books to read, experts to follow, and more resources on NBC10.com. You can also watch past editions of our Race in Philly series. Just go to NBC10.com/race101. And thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Race in Philly. I'm Jim Rosenfield.
I'm Jacqueline London. Have a good night.